I think I'm what you would call a disillusioned sociologist. My origins are in that particular discipline, but increasingly I've taken on a kind of an interdisciplinary persona, and I'm now a professor of cities at Newcastle, which is a thematic rather than a discipline, and I think that says something about something I want to say. Second thing I want to say is that I am in fact just one person. I'm sometimes mistaken because I've worked on digital issues across both kind of cultural studies on the one hand, but also on predictive analytics and geodemographics and statistics on the other. And I once gave a paper at a cultural studies conference, and someone came up after me and said it must be really, really difficult working in this field because there's another really boring bloke who also works, who's got exactly the same name as you have. So I want to try and sort of tell a story about a sociological positioning working across two different fields around cultural studies and also around statistics, really. And it is 25 years. I think the first thing we did was a book that came out in 95. We produced in 93, 94, which was with Sage, and it was a book called Cyberpunk, Cyber Bodies, Cyberspace. And it was an attempt to use the novelist William Gibson as a prefigurative social theorist. And I want to return to that book at the end, because it turned out that many of the characters who were young cultural studies theorists who contributed to that book are now major figures behind the alt-right. And I think there's an interesting kind of history and connection between a kind of a radicalism associated with a libertarian form of cybernetic culture in the early 1990s that has been transmogrified into something that is quite troubling. So that was a book with Mike Featherstone, published with Sage. It was one of the very early special issues of another interdisciplinary journal, and I want to kind of stress the interdisciplinarity of the digital here. And that was a journal called Body and Society, and it was one of the first books, along with the Atlas of Cyberspace, that actually had cyberspace in the title within academia. Came out in about 95. At the same time as working on that, I was interested in the technology of geodemographics, and especially the way in which there seemed to have been a kind of a hidden history of the use of digital technologies in the corporate sphere that academics hadn't actually paid very much attention to. And we were working on this a good 5 or 6 years before the notion of big data came into play. But it was an attempt to begin to analyse what at that time we began to call digital transactional data that you didn't have to collect, but which was a product of a byproduct of administrative and commercial processes. So we did I didn't think about it geographically. It just happened to be to have a spatial referent. But we got interested in the emergence of geodemographics and what we called internet-based neighbourhood information systems, because this was also the period of websites such as Up My Street, which you might remember, and the beginning of pre Google Maps, but the use of spatially referenced data in a state agency and such like. And at the same time, got interested in histories of statistical technologies, and the way in which, at the time, SPSS, the statistical package for the social sciences, was being transformed into something called predictive analytics. And I think that was a very important point where you moved away from kind of statistical model building and hypothesis testing software towards the turn to big data and predictive analytic technologies. Around about the same time, late 90s, this was about 98, also set up a journal, not with Sage, at this time it was with Routledge, now with Taylor and Francis, which was one of the first journals that tried to bring together in an interdisciplinary way digital technologies. And that's a journal called Information Communication Society, ICS, which has now had its 25th anniversary, edited by my colleague Brian Loader. And on the back of that, into the 2000s now, ran a project or a program for the ESRC called the E-Society program. Don't know if anyone remembers the E-Society program. And it was the most recent of 3 programs, which I think, if you're going to write a history of the digital within the social science, are worth going back to look at in terms of their framings. The first one was called PICT, the Program of Information and Communication Technology. The second one was Virtual Society program, which was directed by Steve Woolgar, which was a STS-inflected program. And the last one that I ran was called the E-Society program, which concluded at the very moment when the notion of Web 2.0 came into play. But I think they're important framings and funding streams that actually structured a lot of what we can see. And I think it's interesting to see that the e-society program was the last kind of major ESRC investment in this area. You've got the digital economy program, you've got various kinds of investments into administrative data sets and so on, but it was the last kind of framing of that program. So we had ICS, and then we were running the e-society program, and on the back of that, Mike Savage and I wrote a paper called The Coming Crisis of Empirical Sociology, and another paper with Dave Beer about Web 2.0, which I think helped kind of frame a lot of kind of methodological debates around in the social sciences, especially again pre-big data as a term, but pointing towards the fact that lots of corporations, especially corporations, were producing huge amounts of data, and it was quite difficult for the social sciences located within the academy to be able to assert a kind of a claim over any special jurisdiction over study of the social. When you had a range of organisations who had data that they themselves owned, that they generated, and indeed increasingly were hiring people to actually begin to analyse that data, not for analytic ends, but for the generation of value and profit. And I was quite serious when I said that when we were doing the early studies of the geodemographics industry, it was quite incredible how many people across the globe had degrees in sociology and cultural studies, and were very au fait with certainly kind of Borgesian forms of analysis. So I think there's a kind of a structural history in terms of UK sociology anyway, in terms of these histories, and I think the role of cultural studies actually shouldn't be underestimated here. Not in terms of a technical methodological expertise, but in terms of theorizations. And actually, one of the key figures here, although I know he's sort of widely despised, but is actually Nigel Thrift, actually, in terms of someone who, although a geographer, actually in a series of books around spatial formations and knowing capitalism, actually provided a kind of a broader theoretical frame that brought these sorts of issues together. But just a couple of things, just to conclude, that I've been working on the last few years that I think are interesting. I'm not sure that they're distinctively sociological at all, and we can talk about whether there is a distinctive digital sociology in a moment. But I do think, there's a really interesting tradition. I suppose it comes primarily out of anthropology, but now for many other disciplines as well, and that's the kind of the affective consequences of digital data and metrics, especially within the workplace and within higher education. In particular. So did a paper a few years ago called Living with the H Index, which was about the quantification of academic work and how we were all feeling about that in terms of a kind of the attempt to make people into kind of competitive entrepreneurial subjects in terms of sort of citation practices and such like, and to begin to think about how that became possible in terms of value creation through the most mundane activities, even the very you said people who don't cite anything before 2010, but the sorts of the implicit decisions that people make about the most mundane form of academic practice is now something that's generative of data that is used to mark you out as someone who gets shortlisted and or someone who a journal will publish explicitly or implicitly because it will improve the impact factor in relation to that journal, and it's simply just citing someone's work. So I think that whole kind of recursive process of academic practice is quite interesting, and now within social media, within altmetrics and all of these other sorts of things, an attempt to actually change what it means to be an academic subject, I think is very interesting. I don't know whether any of that is particularly sociological. I don't know that there's anything very distinctive about sociology, which seems to me to be a discipline which has been sort of so successful that everyone has left it. So the criminologists have gone into law. The economic sociologists have gone into business schools. There doesn't seem to be very much left of sociology as a discipline. So I suppose it's a discipline which I have a primary kind of identification with, but I do think an exciting space to be is somewhere which is post-disciplinary, that is actually quite pragmatic in terms of drawing upon a range of kind of methods and approaches that tackles things thematically, rather than necessarily having an a priori commitment to a set of disciplinary practices. And that's what I suppose I'm trying to do in both my kind of professional, but especially in terms of thinking about teaching. And it might be worth, just as putting down a marker, I would like to think about the implications of what we're talking about here for emerging undergraduate curricula, actually, about whether something that is in the space of radical liberal arts and sciences might be an area that we might want to explore, rather than thinking about organising knowledge in terms of disciplines that probably were pertinent at the beginning of the 20th century, perhaps aren't terribly pertinent to the sorts of challenges that we face at the moment. So that's all a bit higgledy-piggledy, but other than to say that I think there's an attention that needs to be paid to cultural studies in the development of these things. I think there's attention that needs to be paid to methodological developments and the claims that we can now make across all of the social sciences, actually, about having any kind of privileged insight into social processes broadly defined, in competition with the data analytic capacities of the corporate sector. And I do think there's something profound that is happening in relation to digital technologies, which is related both to broader global political and philosophical projects, and how we're all feeling